Okay, so tonight I am going to talk about something that I had been wanting to talk about, and I did hear some interest from others about having conversations about this. So at some point in the future, I will hopefully do a live stream conversation. We can talk about this. But what I wanted to present was my ideas about replacing Tolkien and Lewis. And that's sort of a clickbait thing because obviously I don't think we need to really replace them. But Tolkien and Lewis have been, you know, enthroned in this position of Christian fantasy, and so much work has been done in studying about their lives, about their works. Um, Obviously, there's been many adaptations. The books are perennially redone, but they're certainly of a certain time and place. And I don't want to dismiss that. I think that it's good, but but the problem is that at a certain point, someone could pick up those books and just read them and understand the parallels. They could understand the cultural references and the time and place that they were playing off of. You know, this post World War uh, Britain, and now somebody has to pick up the book and also learn about that time and place before they can fully understand all that stuff. And not only that, because there has been so much analysis and research and things done on it, it really becomes a constricted space for creative thought. I mean, certainly somebody can just pick up the book, make their own observations, but there are literally Lewis and Tolkien scholars with PhDs who are experts and authorities on the men and their works. And if you say something that disagrees with their thought, well, they are experts and you are not. So it's a non canonical thing. Um, and so not only do we need to have updated, newer, versions of them, which, I think they would agree they kind of started the modern genres of fantasy in two ways. um, Lord of the Rings is like the high fantasy, the epic fantasy. Narnia is children's fantasy, fairy tale. Lewis also has his space trilogy, which, when you get to that hideous strength, it borders, it kind of blends into fantasy, modernity, and science fiction, all kind of mushed together, which is a really cool thing. And one of the interesting things is that he talks about, and this makes my point of why we need newer Tolkien's and Lewis, and as Americans, why we need an American Tolkien and Lewis, because what C.S. Lewis says in That Hideous Strength is that he's trying to write a grown up fairy tale, and he says that when we read fairy tales, it starts off in a little woodcutter's cottage out in the forest, and to us that is a mystical, adventurous starting place. But in its time and place, it was supposed to be common. It was supposed to be a commonplace thing. So what he did is he set That Hideous Strength taking place in British college, a little fictional version of Oxford or Cambridge, and because that was the environment he was familiar with, and he did that to show, look, you're gonna wake up out of your bed like any other day, but these magical and mystical things will start to happen to you, and that is what a fairy tale is supposed to be. So the woodcutter's cottage, though it seems like a enchanted place, it was supposed to be a mundane start to the story, and we missed that because of change in time and culture. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time criticizing Lewis and Tolkien, um, but I really want to explore my candidates for who we should be checking out and who deserves to have the level of analysis and attention going forward, I think. So let's see, I'm going to put in here. Okay, so I don't know how readable this will be to people, but I will read the words on these pages here. Now, this was, if you Google American Tolkien, most of the articles will be about George R.R. Martin. And, I'm not going to read all this stuff, but this little blurb here I thought was really, this is why Martin should be the American Tolkien. What really distinguishes Martin and what marks him as a major force for evolution and fantasy is his refusal to embrace a vision of the world as a Manichaean struggle between good and evil. Tolkien's work has enormous imaginative force, but you have to go elsewhere for moral complexity. Martin's wars are multifaceted and ambiguous, as are the men and women who wage them and the gods who watch them and chortle, and somehow that makes them mean more. And this is like this sort of pathetic, atheistic nonsense view of what makes something better or worse. And I think there's a lot of things like, George Martin, it's so raw. Like, he pushes these boundaries. I just, every time I read, I think I read all the books that were published, or maybe he might have come out with one more. I don't even think so. But it's just like, you just imagine this grumpy little troll guy sitting there writing all these sex scenes, getting his, pleasure out of doing that. And it's not sophisticated. It's just worldly. And it does not do what Tolkien and Lewis did for the world of fantasy. I think he was in it to get a TV deal. He got the TV deal. And then it's like, who knows that, I guess that I didn't even see those last seasons because it's not worth watching. I stopped watching it when I got married because I said I'm not going to try to get my wife to watch this with me, so I will not watch it. So beyond the first few seasons, I didn't see it. But everybody talks about how the end of the series was a train wreck, and he got his money, so I don't think he really cares. So with that, we can stop talking about George Martin. And my suggestion for who the American Tolkien is comes from this article. Robert Jordan is the American Tolkien. And this is in a response to that other article, more or less. Let's see. In 2005, Lev Grossman of Time magazine declared that George Martin was the American Tolkien. Since then, you'll be able to find the phrase splashed on just about every one of Martin's wonderful novels. And for good reason, of course. That's a really awesome blurb. I'd love it on my own novels. Or how about just the American Pullman? I would be totally cool with that, Mr. Grossman. Unfortunately, he's talking about his thing. Let's see. I'll just read it. Unfortunately, I think that my series, The Shards of Heaven, this is Michael Livingston who's writing this. I haven't read his series. While it follows Philip Pullman's superb, his dark materials in ultimately positing a new origin story for the gods would not be the right fit for the comparison. Pullman's series is a parallel world fantasy fundamentally in dialogue with John Milton, William Blake, and C.S. Lewis. My series is a historical fantasy set during the time of Antony and Cleopatra that dialogues with history, legend, and myth. He and I are really doing different things, and the same kind of differentiation is true, I think, of Martin and Tolkien. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire might exist in the shadow of The Lord of the Rings. I've written elsewhere about its quasi-medieval setting, but they are tremendously different works in tone, scale, and intent. As terrific as his work is, and seriously, can't put down the pitchforks if you're a fan of Westeros, George R. R. Martin isn't the American Tolkien. Robert Jordan is. In the most simple terms, that's what I want to argue in this essay. James Oliver Rigney Jr., writing as Robert Jordan, created a work of literature, and I certainly don't use that term lightly, that is best understood through the lens of Tolkien's own creative project. The Wheel of Time is the most prominent and successful American response to Tolkien's masterwork. So let's begin with the deceptively simple matter of what it was that Tolkien was up to in his creation of Middle-earth. And for that, we need to understand at a root level what Tolkien did for a living. So this is a pretty long article. I will not read it. I will put the link for it. But he goes on to talk about how Tolkien, is a philologist, deep into languages. I don't remember everything he said in here. So, all right, let me just skip here. Basically, I think he talks some about how, and this is a criticism that people had. The first book of the Wheel of Time, the Eye of the World, people kind of said it was, it's like a copy of Tolkien, because it's the book that has the most similarity. But he very much meant it as an homage, and his series spans on 14 books and was actually finished by another author because he passed away. He had extensive notes. The actual ending of the series he wrote and had finished, but the last few volumes, it was supposed to be one. It was too big to be published as one, so the last 3 volumes were co-written by Brandon Sanderson, who is worthy of mention at some point in this video. But he kind of goes over some of this stuff, and you can get some of it from the Wikipedia page too. So in Robert Jordan's Wikipedia page, you can find out a little bit of his life. He has some similar interesting parallels with Tolkien. Obviously, Tolkien and a lot of his, what happens in his books is born out of his experience of World War I. And he's kind of bringing this deep history. He's creating a mythology of the British people. So he's pulling on all the resources of the people who came to and inhabited the British Isles, and the Vikings, and he's incorporating all that into his the different races that he creates and the different people groups and things like that. And it's like it represents all this real history, but in fantastical terms. Similarly to Tolkien, Robert Jordan was in the army. He served 2 tours of duty during the Vietnam War, which obviously has a similar reputation in the psychological toll that it took on soldiers, and different, and for different reasons, and a different thing. But that reality of a man who's seen war is present in his books. So when he wrote about those things, he did have that true authority in that way. After returning from Vietnam, he studied physics at the Citadel, and he began working for the Navy as a nuclear engineer. And he began writing in 1977. Um, this is some other interesting stuff. So, like Tolkien was very much into language, and language was his specialty. But language can very much connected to history and things like that. And Robert Jordan was also very interested in history. Robert Jordan was a history buff and enjoyed hunting, fishing, sailing, poker, chess, pool, and pipe collecting. He described himself as a high church Episcopalian, which, no one is talking about Episcopalians at all until Tucker Carlson's little speech the other day. But, it's interesting to have someone describe themselves as a high church Episcopalian. And I think that, someone who grew up, he's born in 1948. It's some, as he grows up in that, there was still remnants, I'm sure, of genuine religion in there. And it says here he received communion more than once a week. So to him, his spiritual life was very important. It's mainline American Christianity, like it's part of the fabric of our nation. What that means, is going to be different. Obviously, Tolkien was Catholic. That was very important to him. Politically, he described himself as a libertarian monarchist, which, like that's, what a combination, like that is, we have a lot of these like monarchist type folks coming in our corner. I think, that's probably the kind of, Tolkien was British, he lived under a king. But the libertarian streak, is definitely putting an American spin on things. He lived with his wife, who was a book editor, and she edited his books. And they give some of his favorite authors: John MacDonald, Jane Austen, Louis L'Amour, Charles Dickens, Robert Heinlein, Mark Twain, and Montaigne as favorite authors. Interestingly, so Robert Jordan was his pen name. His real name was James Oliver Rigney Jr., but he also had some other pen names, and he wrote about some other topics. So I have not gotten to read these books yet. So he kind of cut his teeth writing Conan the Barbarian novels, which, he's he wrote seven Conan the Barbarian novels. Conan was first written by Robert Howard, and people said his were some of the best. It was obviously a series. The Conan books were kind of like, they didn't have to have a chronology. It's just Conan pops up, an adventure happens, the book ends. But from what I heard, his were some of the best. And then he also, some other stuff here, but there's some stuff he didn't get around to doing because he died, fairly young, 58. But this is an interesting thing. So he also had a series of books published under the pen name Reagan O'Neill. And they were historical fiction. And he wrote 3 books called the Fallon Saga. And he says he originally planned to take the series much further. And this is the interesting thing that he said. I had intended to do a southern arc of history. The general arc of history that is studied in the United States and recognized is the move out of New England, Pennsylvania, and New York into the Ohio Valley, and from there west to California. And I would say, yes, that was all I knew. And I grew up in New England, so that makes sense. But, he says there was a southern arc, which was the move out of Virginia and the Carolinas into Louisiana and Mississippi, and from there into Texas, and from there through New Mexico and Arizona and into California. And I wanted to follow that in a series of novels that I originally intended to go from the American Revolution through the Vietnam War. But I'll tell you the truth, I got tired of them. They were doing nicely, but I just got tired of them and said, I want to do something else. And what he did instead is he wrote The Wheel of Time. And the interesting thing about The Wheel of Time is that, um, like how Tolkien incorporated, these different kind of European um, people groups and turned them into different races and different types of people. Robert Jordan did the same thing in his Wheel of Time with all of the various cultures that came into America. So, obviously the European influence is there. That's kind of a central thing of it. But then there's Asian influences and even some African influences, and he had even this thing, like, it's kind of interesting because um, some of the groups he said, in his notes he's writing like these people have to have like a southern accent or whatever, and it's just kind of weird. Like, you wouldn't think that based on how their culture was. He kind of mixed things up. He made the like Irish people be the ones that live in the desert. So it's like when you read Dune and you have the Fremen, but his version, they're all like 7 feet tall and they have red hair. So just different stuff, very creative. But the world is very big, and there's a lot of really interesting things. So, and this is why I think it needs to be studied more, because the main protagonist is a messiah figure, and it's basically by about the end of the first book, he realizes he's the one that's this messiah type figure called the Dragon Reborn. And he so through this series you have this struggle where he's the person, and there is like prophecy, like how we had scripture, but he's really wrestling with it. He doesn't make him an infallible, sinless, perfect man like Jesus was, but it is this person knowing, like, oh, I'm destined to make a self-sacrifice. And it's really interesting how that kind of plays out. The choices that he makes, the struggles, he very much feels bound by, you know, I'm supposed to do what the prophecies say I'm supposed to do, but sometimes he rebels, and then his rebellion ends up being the better fulfillment anyway. And it's really interesting because there's a lot of different cultures, and the different cultures have kind of their own different prophecies, and somehow it ends up that he kind of ends up being the Messiah character to a whole bunch of different people groups, except for one where a guy who smart and knows how to manipulate the signs and whatnot, basically kind of becomes like the Antichrist. So you can find out more about that in the last book. And it has a lot of just really great characters, and it's huge. It's 14 freaking huge books. So if you haven't read it, it's not a small commitment, but I think that it takes some serious consideration. They did put a season of TV show out on Amazon. It looks amazing. I feel like they got the looks right. They messed a whole bunch of crap up, so I can't recommend it. Read the books. I wouldn't recommend anybody watch the show if they haven't read the books. But it is what it is. That's the way of TV adaptations, I guess. So, so Robert Jordan, he's the American Tolkien. There's all sorts of stuff in here in this article. It's good. Now, um, interestingly, so the guy that finishes it, Brandon Sanderson, if you don't know who he is, he's like the biggest writer of fantasy books alive today. He writes faster than anybody else. And it's kind of interesting to me that, like, Robert Jordan is an Episcopalian, the mainline Protestant. The guy that finishes the series is a Mormon. And Mormonism is a weird American religion. So it's Christian-esque. I think it's actually like there's a lot of really good Mormon fiction writers because the Book of Mormon is fiction. So if you believe it's true, you will be good at writing fictional stories. If that offends anybody, tough luck. And speaking of Mormons, and so I think Brandon Sanderson, you can pick up on a lot of interesting themes in his books too, but that's a whole nother discussion. But I was just thinking about Mormon writers. The other one that comes to mind is Orson Scott Card, who's very well known for Ender's Game, but he also had this really interesting series called The Tales of Alvin Maker, and it's a alternate history that takes place in America in the early 19th century. And there's like magic and stuff, and he does the same thing, because he's it's more blatant because it actually takes place in America. There's lots of real American characters in it, but it's all alternate personalities and a totally alternate story. Definitely an interesting series that I would put in the like you may also like category. I don't think it would it doesn't stand to make him America's Tolkien, but it's interesting. It's an interesting thing. And then another one that I would say is a really interesting series is by this guy Brent Weeks, and so it's interesting. Orson Scott Card and Brandon Sanderson, they're Mormons. They write squeaky clean books. Brent Weeks is, from what I understand, I think he's like an evangelical Christian or something, but he's not, his prose isn't the best. It's not like he's not super polished. I think he's just not as experienced as some of these other guys, but he has a series called the Lightbringer series that was really interesting. And some of the things that I really liked about it that made me kind of think of this as like, oh, Tolkien, it's an American descendant of Tolkien. He puts more like stuff in it, like that makes it like R-rated, like George Martin, but then the Christian themes are very present. So it's an interesting approach, whereas the Mormon authors will make their books age appropriate for kids or whatever. But some of the stuff that I thought was interesting is like he put it in a slightly different time frame. Like instead of starting it at the like medieval times, it's all like muskets and stuff and pirate ships and things like that. So, which is interesting because that's like that's the time frame of America's history. America doesn't have a history in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, it's just Native Americans. So, and I think that's kind of the problem is that when fantasy writers focus so much on that medieval time frame, it makes their story have distinctly European roots, and it doesn't fit the American thought process the same way. So Lightbringer series, I would put that as like also you should check out. And if anyone has read it, I've not gotten to talk to anybody else that's read it. Interesting. He went to Hillsdale College, so it's like Peterson adjacent a little bit. But then, so that's all, say, the American Tolkien. But then we need an American Lewis. And for an American Lewis, this is a much more, it's different. He's not the same as Lewis, but it's much more of a close parallel. And for that, I would say Andrew Peterson. And of course, as a writer, comparing to Narnia, Andrew Peterson is the author of the Wingfeather Saga, which they're not, and it's not like Narnia where it's blatant allegory or whatever. It's a little bit more Tolkien-esque in the way that there's themes and there's types and there's things that you got to mix that are kind of mixed in. You have to eke them out, but it is very much closer to Narnia in that it's aimed at a younger audience, and it has the whimsical quality. I think we mistake. It's tough. It's tough to put Narnia in its time and place. Like, I feel like originally Narnia was written for, like, I don't know, really young kids, but then because it's old and Lewis was a very good writer, and now we talk like idiots, and because we're American, it's aged up. Like, you have to be older to just get it right away. I mean, I read it to my daughter that's 5, and my 3-year-old too. She's there listening to it. I think it pushes their vocabulary. It's good. So, but so it's still good to read to kids if you want your kids to be smart. Wingfeather is thematically probably for a little bit of older kids. The bad guys are much more bad. It's has one series out as a cartoon that I haven't finished the whole series, but the episodes that I watched were pretty good. Much better and closer to the theme of the book series than the Wheel of Time adaptation is. But Andrew Peterson, as you can see here, he's classified as musician, and that's his main thing. So that's obviously different than Lewis, but he's a very smart guy. He's written some nonfiction books that are also very good. They're very helpful for me in kind of figuring out some of my ideas for tectonic school, because he's very much about seeking God through creative endeavors. And in his book, God of the Garden, he relates that to, like, you got to go out in the garden, be among the trees to connect to nature. And he's been on some things of like C.S. Lewis Society and all that stuff. His music's also very good. Most of his music is all storytelling. It all tells stories. His Behold the Lamb of God album performance, he does it every year. It's a Christmas thing, but it goes from Exodus all the way through the Passion, through a series of songs. So it's pretty sophisticated for, like, something that's folky, rock. And to me, that's kind of like, yeah, it is an American version, because we're a young country, we don't have thousands of years of history. So our folkiness and the pioneer spirit kind of weaves its way into things more. So he's going to be a little more rough around the edges. But he also did start something called the Rabbit Room. And as you can see on this page, there's an article about C.S. Lewis, the mystical builder. And the Rabbit Room was actually the name of the room in a pub where the Inklings, Lewis, Tolkien, and their friends met and would share stories and smoke pipes and all that stuff. And so what he did is he started this thing called the Rabbit Room, which is like a collection of other authors and artists, and trying to kind of like create some of that Inkling type community. And they're, again, mostly brown people in Nashville. They even have like a conference every year, and it's very interesting. So he talks extensively about how Lewis and Tolkien are huge influences, and so I think that really these guys are all doing the thing that Lewis and Tolkien probably would have wanted. Oh, I didn't share this one little thing. I should say they're definitely doing the things that Lewis would have wanted. This is a funny little thing I read in here, just the Reddit thread or whatever. But did J.R.R. Tolkien dislike America or Americans? And this was a quote from a letter in regard to American hippies loving his books. The horrors of the American scene I will pass over, though they have given me great distress and labor. They arise in an entirely different mental climate and soil, polluted and impoverished to a degree only paralleled by the lunatic destruction of the physical lands which the Americans inhabit. So he had a little bit of a distaste and a disdain for Americans. So, I mean, that's all right. I mean, hey, the hippies loved his books, even if he didn't love the hippies. I mean, I would say that was probably, my dad was in that category. He told me, like, it was like the first big purchase he ever made when he was like 14 or something. He bought hardcover editions of The Lord of the Rings, and he still has them. So, but we as Americans deserve authors that understand being Americans, and this is why I think it's important, is because people are looking for enchantment. They're looking to find the mythological roots of what it means to be a person nowadays, and to be an American. And a lot of it comes off as being inauthentic. It's a LARP. The people that are, whether you're converting to a different Eastern Orthodoxy or something, well, but you're not from Greece. You don't have that pedigree. The church may be thousands of years old, but you're a new member. You're still an American. I'm not trying to push on. I don't want to be too critical of that. Like, but I understand. I think that's some of the impulse of it. The impulse is that we don't realize that there is a richness to our story as Americans. It's different. It's not the same. We have to figure it out. And so I think that's why we need to study these authors and these books, because they did live in this world and try to enchant it. And one of the things I really love about Andrew Peterson is he talks a little bit this somewhere else, but he talks about reading the book The Yearling, and he grew up in the town, or near the town in Florida where it took place. He moved to Florida when he was like 10. He lived in Illinois before that. He really loved it in Illinois. He moved to Florida and he was like, this place is depressing. There's no magic here. And he just had a bad feeling about the place where he grew up. And heck, it's Florida. It's like, and it's not even like one of the cool parts. It's like the swampy part of Florida. And and then he read this book, The Yearling, and he wrote an amazing song about it. And I read that book too. And it's interesting because I think originally it was a book that was assigned to school kids, like it's a young adult book. But I think it's much more impactful to read it as a father. It's a coming of age story. It's about a young boy. That's why they give it to young kids to read. But I think it's more impactful as an adult to read it. And what I like about that is that he basically came to grips with the fact that, like, we live in this country that's a concrete jungle or whatever. It's not like Britain where there's ancient pastures and walking paths connecting the whole countryside. We do have these big agro farms. We have Walmarts and strip malls and subdivisions that, all the houses look the same. And some of that stuff's unfortunate, but we can't just tear it down and make it into jolly old England. We can't just retreat into Tolkien's world or some other fantasy. We need to learn how to see it for what it is and realize that there is still a magic there, and there is a history and an enchantment. And the amazing part about that is, even though we may not prefer that story is ours, and we get to be a part of it. And this is a big part of what I'm trying to do with my other channel, with the Tectonic School, is I really think that we need to, this thing of re-enchanting. Now, we want to re-enchant our lives by looking back at the time that we think was enchanted. But if you were in that time and place, Tolkien had to craft that story, because the life that he actually lived was trench warfare in World War One, and that's awful. That's not enchanted. I can't think of a less romantic thing. The only good thing he could pull out of it was the camaraderie between soldiers who, all they had was each other. Well, that just means the whole rest of their life was awful. And so I think, now that we live in an era where we have these books that others have written, we can escape into them, and so many other things, we could escape into. Tolkien and Lewis, they didn't have as much to escape into. Their library of, escapist fantasy would run out rather quickly. And so what did they have to do? They had to craft their own stories, and they had to make it relate to the time and the place in which they lived. And that's what we have to do as well. And I think that when we insist on going back to Tolkien and Lewis, and they're the only ones that we can focus on, we're missing out, because there's been a lot of work that people have done. A lot of people have taken what they've done and they have updated it. It's not to say it's better necessarily, but it's more ours. And I think that Christians need to put a little bit of the effort that goes into studying Tolkien and Lewis into some of these other stories. And maybe they won't be as exciting at first, but I don't know. I think there's a lot you can say about them. There's a lot of stuff in there. And hopefully, if you have already read some or all of these series, then you can be someone we can talk about it. If not, they're my recommendations for a good starting place. Some books to check out. And I think they can stand on their own pretty well. So anyway, that's the rundown. That's my list of candidates for replacing Lewis and Tolkien. Not really replacing, but updating and some guys that deserve a little bit of the attention that the classics receive. All right. Thank you for listening.